Hello! I hope you're doing well. I'm going to make a video where I'm going to talk to you about the topic of which Linux GUI to choose. So I will try to guide you in choosing a Linux GUI. And at the same time, I will take advantage of this video to talk to you and answer the question of which Linux distribution to choose. Because the answer is very similar to the GUI. So it's a kind of video that I would have liked to listen to. 22 years ago when I started using Linux, and I got a little lost in the list of Linux distributions. So, when I make videos that explain how to download a Linux distribution, there is a moment where I talk about which graphical interface to choose. Currently, I was recording the video on how to download and install Ubuntu Linux, and I was talking about Ubuntu flavors. So a variant of Ubuntu with another graphical interface than Gnome, the one chosen by default by the Ubuntu team. So which one to choose? That is the big question. Actually, to make a long story short, there are several GUIs in Linux. Each graphical interface has its own philosophy, its own way to present a desktop interface. The menu bars, the themes, and the parameters of the graphical interface, honestly, there is no one better than others. It's always a personal taste. Your mission is to find the GUI where you feel comfortable and enjoy using. The one that you find efficient, that you find ergonomic. Some graphical interfaces or Linux distributions will have the mission of offering a very light graphical interface that can run on old PCs. Others will try to have a futuristic look with a lot of animation. This is why it is difficult to answer the question, which is the best GUIs or Linux distribution, because it depends on your situation. I will still try to give examples of cases later in the video and give examples of distributions that meet different needs. If you want to know which one I use, I always use the KDE GUI. So if I have to install Ubuntu for my home computer, I will choose the KDE graphical interface. This Ubuntu version is named Kubuntu. So, how to know which one you'll like? You have many ways. Look some screenshots. Visit Linux distribution webpage. Try some Linux live images. Try Linux on a virtual machine. This YouTube channel will try to help you. If we come back to Ubuntu example on their website, you can go to the page about flavors, other versions of Ubuntu. You have a small description of each version and a picture of what it looks like. So that can be a first step to know and say, I like how it looks and I want to try it. For each version, we have a get button to download it. So we have Lubuntu with another graphical interface, Budgie, Cinnamon. I'll let you explore all of this. And it's the same principle for other Linux distributions. For example, for Fedora Linux, you also have a page with variants. In the case of Debian Linux, it is during installation that you will be able to choose which graphics variant you want to install. In this video, I will continue to show you images of GUIs and Linux distributions, while I talk and elaborate on the subject of this video. I am not going to describe each of them. There are a lot of things to say. If the demand is there, I would rather go for many description videos. One video by graphical interface and one video by Linux distribution. Video where we go into detail for each one. But otherwise, when you want to try a Linux distribution and you don't know which interface to choose, I advise you to take the default one. Start with the default one. Familiarize yourself with the system. Familiarize you with Linux too, if it is the first time you use it. Why the default one? Because normally, the default one is the one organized and supported by the official Linux distribution team, while the others are often organized by the community. It is true for Ubuntu. That doesn't mean that variant made by the community are not good. They are good variant. It's just that for my part, previously when I used a Linux distribution for the first time, I always went with all the default options. It was with time and experience using Linux that I discovered the one I liked the most. It is true for the Linux distribution and the GUI interface. And it is with time that I came to the conclusion that I like to work with the KDE interface. I passed many years using the Cinnamon interface too, and previously the old Gnome interface, Gnome 2. Now, sometime I try certain Linux distributions because I'm interested to try them, and very often I try them with their KDE variant. When I check different point and options offered by the Linux distribution, I know what I need. But that came with time and experience. When you start your Linux journey, let's keep it simple. I will suggest you Linux Mint if you start. We will talk about it soon. There was also a time when I had a desire to try several Linux distributions and several GUIs for a change. And I tried many of them, but that too came with experience and time. For my recommendation, if you come from the Windows world, the default graphical interface of Ubuntu, the Gnome interface is very different from the graphical interface of Microsoft Windows. If you want something similar, it would be to try KDE or Cinnamon. And if you choose to use Cinnamon, I recommend using Linux Mint rather than Ubuntu. This is my personal recommendation. Why Linux Mint rather than Ubuntu? Because in fact, the Cinnamon GUI was created by the Linux Mint team. So that's why I recommend Linux Mint if you want to use Cinnamon. And Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu. So those who made Linux Mint took the base of Ubuntu and then added their graphical interface, their tools, modify some things to go with their Linux distribution philosophy. So you're going to have the stability of the LTS version of Ubuntu, but with good integration of Linux Mint with their Cinnamon GUI as it was designed. So, for those who want to start using Linux for the first time, I recommend choosing Linux Mint because it's a very stable Linux distribution. It is the one that I have the fewest problems and things to configure after installation. Linux Mint guides us well during the first configuration. All the main things are configured with a graphical tool. It is a distribution that listens a lot to its community of users to make decisions, which also remains very conservative in changes with a classic graphical interface, but which remains effective. So, it's stable and easy to configure after the installation. Few things are needed to be configured. As an example, for Fedora, if you want to use multimedia content, you must install multimedia codecs. Even if it's not very hard, it is nice how Linux Mint and Ubuntu propose it during the installation. As with Ubuntu, it is easy to configure the graphical card drivers with the default driver tools. So, here is my recommendation if you come from the Microsoft Windows world. As I said earlier, this is a personal recommendation. It is possible you are not agreed with them. On next, we also have the business world. For servers, we have Red Hat Linux, Oracle Linux 2, which is very similar to Red Hat Linux. These Linux distributions are supported for a very long time, 10 years. These distributions focus on the business use, stability, and long-term support. And in the case of servers usage, I always install the Linux distribution without a graphical interface. I want them smaller as possible and with a few services as possible. Fewer libraries, fewer graphic libraries, etc. So, it gives the server less chance of having a security breach, and it is faster to update and start up. Ubuntu Server is also a good Linux distribution for servers that I have used a few times, even if my experience is mainly on Red Hat Linux, Oracle Linux, and CentOS in the past, which could now be replaced by Rocky Linux. Don't forget SUSE Linux 2 for the world of servers and business. For business workstations, well, earlier I was talking about Linux Mint and his Cinnamon interface, where we can have an experience easy and more similar to what we have in Microsoft Windows. I didn't quickly find out if we could get paid support with Linux Mint. It seems to have been an option in the past, but not anymore. I'm talking about the possibility of having a support contract where you can call if you have a problem. In business, if you have several critical workstations that use an operating system, it is often relevant to have support in case of a problem. So, this is perhaps one of the weaknesses of Linux Mint to not have a paid support. A weakness for the business situation for companies that would need this. In your case, do you have Linux workstations? What distribution are you using? Do you need a support service? In a business situation, paid support is sometimes necessary. When a company has server or workstations that are used for critical things, a pay support option is often mandatory for the OS. So these are the strengths of Ubuntu, Red Hat Linux, and SUSE Linux. Red Hat Linux and SUSE Linux use by default the Gnome graphical interface. And only that desktop environment seemed to be supported by the full enterprise support. Doing research for Kubuntu, so the Ubuntu variant with KDE, it seems to have a company that offers commercial support. If I look at the Ubuntu support pricing page, phone and ticket support seem to be included for packages from the Universe repository. KDE Desktop is installable from the Universe repository. It is not something very clear, and it is not something I tested.
In a business situation, on your case, is it something you use and have?
A Linux distribution paid support for workstation where you can call them if you have issue. Do you using another desktop environment than Gnome? I don't want to start a debate between Gnome versus KDE or other desktop environment. The only thing is in the perspective that we would like to replace workstations from Windows to Linux. Let's say, for example, we have 50 users in a company. Maybe for some users, it would be an easier option if they had a more classic graphical interface with an experience closer to Windows 10, like Cinnamon or KDE. So these are personal thoughts. Do you agree with these points? This could be a topic for a future video. What is Linux missing for the workstation world? And that topic can be interesting, especially with the Windows 10 support ending in 2025. Rather than saying that millions of PCs will have to be thrown away with the end of Windows 10 support, can we create a new alternative? Our media often talk about global warming and problems with the environment. Perhaps it is time to create a program to promote open-source systems. And Linux would be a good ecological point to explore and develop to avoid throwing away millions and billions of computers in 2025. But maybe it's just not a good economic point for our multimillionaire friends. Well, I hear that I'm getting off topic. So I try to imagine a Linux distribution that would have a classic GUI, but with the range of support and enterprise software like Red Hat Linux can offer. At the same time, I know that Red Hat Linux 7 offered a KDE GUI in his official repositories in the past. So if they disappeared with Red Hat Linux 8, there might be a reason. Maybe there wasn't enough demand for it. Do not hesitate to share your experiences on this subject if you have any. It could perhaps help certain people or certain companies which would like to migrate workstations to Linux. Otherwise, there are several Linux distributions for several needs. Maybe you've already heard about rolling releases. So, what is a rolling release distribution? This is a Linux distribution evolving regularly and quickly. I will try to explain it. A Linux distribution offers many software packages. It can be software, tools, services, and graphical interface. Normally, with a normal Linux distribution, many of these packages stay at the same version during all life of the Linux distribution release. For a rolling release, it is different. As soon a new version of a software provided by this Linux distribution repository is released, this new version will be integrated into it and will be offered as update if you have it installed in your machine. And it's not just about software, it's also true about the libraries, services, and the Linux kernel. As an example of rolling release distribution, we have Arch Linux, OpenSUSE Tumbleweed, and Manjaro. So, it can be fun to always have the latest versions of everything on our Linux distribution, but there is the downside that any change always has a risk of breaking something. If you have several years of computer experience, this may be something you have already experienced with the arrival of a new software update. This major update contains several very cool features, but new bugs appear with this version and are only corrected a few weeks later. So, with a rolling release, there is a higher chance to see new bugs appear. You will receive bigger updates since everything is updated often. Expect to download some gigabytes per week for all rolling release updates. As you can see, it is probably not a good option for a business context. If you have to manage 50 workstations, it is impossible to use and supporting a rolling release. In this context, it is probably better to use a conservative Linux distribution about software releases policy. There will be a few changes during all life of this release version, and normally each release version is supported many years. Only some software like internet browsers will change version. But for the rest, the kernel, the libraries, graphical tools, graphical interfaces and services, they will remain at the same version. Of course, the Linux distribution supports team will make minor updates if a security breach or bug is discovered. But there will never have an update integrating new features into a distribution like Debian, Red Hat Linux, or Ubuntu in the kernel, libraries and services, etc. So in a non-rolling release distribution, if you want the newer software's stack provides by the distribution, you need to upgrade to a new version of your OS. This really has the advantage of having control over your machine. You choose when you will make that upgrade. Normally, it is very easy and fast to upgrade. Also, when you use a distribution like Red Hat Linux, it is supported for 10 years, so once it is installed, you have several years to be able to use this system without major maintenance concerning the OS. For home usage too, there are several advantages of having a stable system with few changes once installed. This way, you don't have any bad surprises or bugs that appear because you had a major update of several software programs or other part of the system. Another thing to say about rolling release is you have a good chance to have to use command line sometime. For example, in the OpenSUSE Tumbleweed documentation, I saw that the only recommended way to update a tumbleweed is from the command line. So, certain types of distributions may require more technical knowledge to use them. And sometimes you will have to use the command line to do some tasks. It is not a negative point because it has some advantage to use command line, but it is important to note that it is not for everyone. And this is where Linux Mint have some good point. It is very well equipped with graphical tools to manage everything necessary in the system. And today in 2024, since several years, if you really need a new version for a specific software, there are technologies like Flatpak or Snap which allow you easily to install another version of a software. So, why am I talking to you about all type of Linux distribution in this video? Because it has a reason to have several Linux distributions. Each one have their own philosophy. Some focus on stability and the enterprise environment, others focus on video games. There are other Linux distributions that focus on older computers, so having the lightest graphical interface possible. Other one try to have a really futuristic, super nice GUI, like you will see in the futuristic movies. So all tastes and needs are in nature. Some focus on very stable environment, others want focus on the future Linux technologies. A good example for this is Fedora Linux, which tries to have the latest versions of things. The Fedora community is sponsored by Red Hat, and Red Hat engineer is very involved in the development of stuff like the Gnome interface, systemd, the Linux kernel, etc. Fedora Linux is used to show and stabilize the integration of the latest development about it. I don't want to say Fedora is a beta version of Red Hat. Fedora is a stable distro, but normally things out since many years are more stable than things out since some weeks or months. So Fedora Linux show what Red Hat Linux will look like in the coming years. When Red Hat create a new major version of Red Hat Linux, they use as base a Fedora Linux. That things about Fedora and Red Hat is just for information. Let's go back to our topic. So, there's a purpose to having many choose of Linux distribution. Things like Fedora or things like rolling release might be what you're looking in for your system. But being a technological showcase in certain cases can cause potential bugs or less mature stuff integrated into the distribution. So, if I come back to my recommendation, personally, if you don't want to waste time to choose which Linux distribution you want to use, especially if you come from Windows, use Linux Mint with his default interface. After some tests, depending on your case, if for example your computer is very old and you find the Cinnamon graphical interface too heavy, maybe try another GUI offered by Linux Mint. But normally, all computer running Windows 10 will easily run Linux Mint and Cinnamon. If Linux Mint seemed too heavy because you have a very old computer, maybe opting for very light Linux distribution will be necessary. If your computer is very new and Linux Mint seems to have some issues with recent hardware, maybe it might be a good idea to use Fedora Linux, which has a recent kernel. The Linux kernel is the things on the operating system communicating with the hardware. That's why a very recent kernel can sometimes be needed for a recent computer. Rolling release distro like OpenSUSE Tumbleweed can be interesting if you want very recent software. With a rolling release, you will have a lot of changes regularly, more than Fedora Linux. If you're a fan of macOS, of the macOS interface, I know there are Linux distributions trying to look like macOS. It's not something I'm a fan of, so I've never used and try it. But these are examples of stuff you can explore once you feel comfortable and want to go further with Linux. Or even at the beginning, you can try those macOS style if you feel that is what you want. So, after thinking about all of this, what would be my final recommendation for this video? Linux Mint for new people in the Linux world. After, for people with some experience, I found Debian Linux more fast than Ubuntu and Linux Mint. Debian is my personal choice, Debian with the KDE graphical environment. So, all that to say that if you have a desire to go further, take a look at other Linux distributions. Look at their images, what they look like, their philosophy, and see if one of the Linux distributions interests you according to your need. Check their philosophy and their support life. Do you want a system that you will be able to use for at least 4 years before you have to upgrade or change it? Or on the opposite side, you need a regular change and you like to try new things every 6 months. It is an advantage to have several Linux distributions and choice. But I must admit that it can also be a disadvantage. Because when you start and want to try, you can quickly get lost in all the choices you have. And at the same time, a lot of effort is put into several Linux distributions, while if there were maybe less, maybe there would be more work put into the main ones. I don't know too much. It's very philosophical as reflections. So there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of having the choice, and this is what we have in the Linux world, is if we don't like something, it is possible to find a new Linux distribution or a new graphical interface. Whereas it is something impossible with Microsoft Windows. If you are a fan of Microsoft Windows 10, the day that it will no longer be supported by Microsoft, you will have to say bye-bye. You will be forced to go to Microsoft Windows 11 and soon 12, which will be boosted to artificial intelligence. And Microsoft Windows, year after year, become heavier. So the fact of having a single graphical interface and a single option as OS in Microsoft Windows, we are caught in what Microsoft forces us to use. We have to accept what it is imposed in the different versions of Microsoft Windows. So there are the advantages to have many Linux distributions. And to conclude, let's talk about my first adventure with Linux. What was the Linux distribution and graphical interface did I use for the first time? It was Slackware Linux, which I really don't recommend for beginners. But at this time, it was the easiest one. I didn't have a good internet connection, so a friend gave me some CDs. They were to install Slackware Linux. It was not easy to install and make him work. Some years later, I tried Ubuntu, It was a new Linux distribution with a lot of high potential and easy to configure. And this time, Ubuntu came with the Gnome 2 as graphical interface. I love the old Gnome interface. I even preferred Gnome to KDE at this time. Sometime later, I had a little adventure with OpenSUSE Linux, which integrated Compiz very well, and it was easy to make work the fire effects when a window was closed. Of course, it was during my teenage years, and having all these effects was just too cool. Here is my little story about which Linux distribution I used at the beginning. I will maybe develop later in another video with some anecdotes of the first times I used Linux, the history and why I wanted to try it. But just to spoil this future video a little bit, I would like to thank Windows Millennium for being so bad and really making me to want to try something else. So that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed the format and I hope that video helped you too. I tried to give some suggestions according to the scenario and little tips to guide you if you are new to Linux and wondering which Linux distribution and which graphical interface to choose. Of course, in some cases, I went with personal opinions. So it was a bit of an informative video, but also some reflections on these subjects. Do not hesitate to write in the comments what you thought. What do you agree with, what you disagree with? Do not hesitate to share your experiences, how it was the first time you tried Linux, which graphical interface you prefer, which Linux distribution you prefer, and why. As you saw in the video, I scrolled through some Linux distribution images. These are all the Linux distributions that I have installed in virtual machines. Of course, there were many others to show that I do not have installed and that I didn't show. So if your favorite Linux distribution was not shown, and it is a popular distribution or gaining a lot of popularity in recent years, I apologize. I showed the ones I had installed, but I know there are many other Linux distributions that also deserve to be seen, and I apologize for not showing them. But feel free to write in the comments which ones you would have liked to saw. And next year I will maybe do this video again, but with new images and new reflections, new ideas. So have a good day.
And bye-bye.